The fog was a living shroud, a constant, pearlescent presence that clung to the windows of my small, solitary observatory, blurring the edges of the world. Here, in the heart of the foggy village, where the salt-laced air carried the perpetual scent of brine and damp earth, I, Dr. Grant Chen, found my solitude. The village itself was a collection of hunched stone structures, their roofs perpetually glistening, their few inhabitants' figures glimpsed briefly through the vaporous veil before vanishing again. It was a place for forgetting, for being forgotten, and for me, a crucible for relentless focus. My days bled into nights, indistinguishable save for the deepening blue-black outside my dome. Inside, the quiet hum of the instrumentation was my only companion, a constant mechanical breath against the vast, silent void I probed. My work, an obsessive communion with the distant echoes of creation, required an isolation few could endure. I sought the whisper of ancient stars, the murmur of nascent galaxies, the grand, impersonal symphony of the cosmos. Never did I anticipate a voice. It began subtly, a ghost in the machine, a faint ripple in the meticulously calibrated data streams that flowed across my monitors. A flicker, almost imperceptible, against the familiar cosmic background noise. For days, I dismissed it as an artifact, a transient interference, perhaps even a nascent flaw in the aging array itself. My determined nature demanded a logical explanation, a terrestrial culprit. I meticulously checked every cable, recalibrated every sensor, purged every line of code for anomalies. The fog outside, thick as clotted cream, seemed to mock my efforts, its tendrils pressing against the glass like inquisitive, blind fingers. Yet, the anomaly persisted. It wasn't a sudden spike, nor a random burst. Instead, it possessed a peculiar, almost rhythmic quality, a gentle undulation that defied all known astrophysical phenomena. I spent a week hunting for its source, convinced it was a terrestrial emission, some rogue signal from a fishing trawler or a distant, forgotten military installation. I mapped the entire electromagnetic spectrum within a 100-mile radius of the foggy village, cross-referencing against every known human-made frequency. Nothing. The signal remained, a persistent, almost polite tap at the edge of my perception. Then, it strengthened. Not abruptly, but with an almost geological slowness, as if a distant, gargantuan clock had merely begun to resonate with greater force. The faint undulation sharpened, resolving into a repeating pattern. My fingers, stained with coffee and the faint metallic tang of circuit boards, hovered over the keyboard. I isolated the frequency, filtering out the overwhelming static of the universe, and the pattern emerged, stark and undeniable on the spectral analysis display. It wasn't a simple pulse, nor a chaotic burst. It was structured. My breath hitched. The air in the dome, usually cool and dry, suddenly felt thick, unyielding. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes tracing the intricate peaks and troughs. This was not the random static of deep space, nor the uniform emission of a pulsar. This was deliberate, layered, complex. It possessed an internal logic that screamed of intelligence, yet it was unlike any waveform I had ever observed, any pattern theorized by human minds. It was too perfect, too intricate, yet utterly alien in its geometry. My mind, usually a fortress of scientific reason, found itself assailed by a cascade of impossible questions. Where was it coming from? I spent another night, then another, lost in the data. The signal seemed to hum directly into my bones, bypassing my ears, resonating with something primal. I ran sophisticated algorithms, attempting to decipher its underlying structure, to find a mathematical key. Each attempt yielded only more layers of impossible complexity, like peeling an onion only to find endless, fractal surfaces beneath. The signal was not merely encoded, it was woven, a tapestry of information so dense, so profound, that my most powerful processors struggled to even parse its basic syntax. The fog outside pressed closer, a silent witness to my dawning horror. This was not a scientific marvel, it was something else entirely. The sheer antiquity implied by its origin point, combined with its impossible structure, began to gnaw at the edges of my rational mind. I knew, with a certainty that was both exhilarating and terrifying, that I had stumbled upon something that would redefine humanity's place in the cosmos. But as the impossible patterns continued to scroll across my screen, repeating with an unwavering, relentless precision, a different kind of realization began to curdle in my gut. This signal, so ancient, so complex, felt less like a discovery and more like an invocation. It was not merely a transmission from something, it felt like a transmission for something. And that something, I slowly began to fear, was me. My world, once vast and ordered by the laws of physics, was suddenly shrinking, collapsing inward, with this impossible, ancient voice at its center. The tension in the dome was palpable, a suffocating presence. I was no longer merely observing, I was being observed. And the signal, still unfolding its intricate, alien beauty on the screen, seemed to hold a gaze both ancient and deeply, unnervingly personal. The signal, a ghost from an impossible distance, had finally manifested. My fingers, trembling with a blend of awe and a strange, cold dread, danced over the console. The screens in my small observatory, usually a canvas of cosmic static and distant, familiar blips, now pulsed with a pattern of impossible complexity. This was it, the whisper from the void that had broken through the silence of the universe, a silence I had dedicated my life to hearing. I was a man possessed, driven by the purest scientific hunger. Hours blurred into a singular, focused stream of action. I ran diagnostics, cross-referenced stellar catalogs, and filtered through layers of interstellar noise, each step a confirmation, a validation of the impossible. The signal was real. It was ancient, its waveform suggesting a journey through epochs of cosmic time, and it was undeniably artificial. Not merely a random burst, but an intricate tapestry of information, woven with a precision that defied any natural origin. The sheer elegance of its structure initially captivated me. It wasn't a simple binary pulse, but a symphony of nested frequencies, a language without a dictionary. My algorithms, designed to sift through the mundane, struggled to grasp its inherent logic. It was like trying to measure the wind with a ruler. Yet, the challenge only sharpened my resolve. I pored over the spectral analysis, watching the vibrant hues on the display shift and morph with an almost organic grace. Each peak and trough, each subtle modulation, spoke of an intelligence so vast, so alien, it humbled me into silent reverence. I had found what every radio astronomer dreams of, a voice from the profound depths, a cosmic echo of life beyond our comprehension. But as the initial euphoria began to wane, replaced by the methodical grind of analysis, a disquiet began to settle. It started subtly, a discordant note in the otherwise perfect harmony of the data. I noticed recurring motifs, complex fractals that seemed to repeat, yet each iteration carried a minute, almost imperceptible deviation. A pattern would emerge, suggesting a clear logical progression, only to twist upon itself, creating a self-referential loop that defied conventional interpretation. It was as if the signal was speaking a language designed to be understood only in glimpses, its full meaning forever receding, just beyond the grasp of my processing power. Then, the distortions began to bleed into my immediate reality. I was staring at a particularly intricate sequence, a cascade of interlocking frequencies that seemed to spiral inward, when the ambient hum of the observatory's cooling systems seemed to waver, deepening in pitch for a fleeting moment before returning to its normal drone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, attributing it to fatigue. The air, usually crisp with the scent of ozone and the damp earth carried in from the foggy village, suddenly felt thick, almost viscous, and for a breath, it tasted faintly of salt and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like old blood. A shiver traced its way down my spine. I glanced around the cramped control room. The fog outside the reinforced windows was a solid, pearlescent wall, but now, its pearly sheen seemed to ripple, as if the very light it diffused was bending, twisting. The digital readouts on an auxiliary monitor flickered, the numbers momentarily blurring into an unreadable smear before snapping back into focus. It was too quick, too ephemeral to be a malfunction, yet too distinct to be entirely imagined. My gaze returned to the primary display. The complex patterns of the signal continued their silent, intricate dance. I zoomed in on one of the repeating motifs, a series of 7 distinct pulses. They were identical, mathematically precise, yet as I stared, focusing intently, the 7th pulse seemed to subtly shift. Not in its frequency or amplitude, but in its very form. It was like watching a perfect circle slowly, imperceptibly, become an octagon, then revert, all within the span of a single breath. The rational part of my mind screamed for an explanation, for a sensor error, a software glitch. But my systems were robust, redundant, designed to eliminate such anomalies. It wasn't a sound I could record, yet I heard it, a soft, insistent murmur that seemed to weave itself through the very fabric of my thoughts. It was a language without words, a suggestion of meaning that never quite coalesced, leaving only a lingering sense of profound unease. The salt-laced air, perpetually thick in the foggy village, now pressed in on me inside the observatory, a physical weight. I felt a prickle of sweat on my brow, despite the cool, regulated air. This wasn't just a signal. It was a presence. And it was beginning to unravel the precise, predictable world I had so carefully constructed. The universe, I realized, was not merely transmitting information, it was speaking, and its voice was beginning to rewrite the very rules of my perception. My breath hitched, a cold tremor running through the marrow of my bones. It was more than a signal, it was an architecture, a language too vast to comprehend, yet it spoke to something deep within me, a premonition of profound alteration. Sleep became a distant shore, a luxury I couldn't afford. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil, fueled by lukewarm coffee and an unyielding, almost feverish, determination. I charted the signal, logged its impossible modulations, tried to dissect its fractal geometry, but it defied every known principle, every mathematical model I threw at it. The quiet hum of my equipment, once a comforting lullaby, now seemed to throb with a nascent sentience, echoing the signal's relentless rhythm. Then came the dreams. I found myself in spaces that defied Euclidean geometry, corridors that curved inward on themselves, rooms where the ceiling met the floor at an impossible angle, walls that breathed like living tissue. I would wander these impossible landscapes, my feet never quite touching the ground, a profound sense of wrongness clinging to me like damp cloth. Faces would coalesce from the ambient glow, indistinct, featureless visages that seemed to observe me with an ancient, knowing patience. I never heard words, but a sense of profound communication permeated these dreams, a quiet understanding that seeped into my waking hours like a stain. I'd wake with a gasp, the phantom weight of those impossible spaces still pressing on my chest. The familiar contours of my small cot, the rough weave of the blanket, felt alien for a moment, as if my hands were not truly my own. I'd shake my head, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, attributing the unsettling visions to exhaustion, to the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the discovery. One morning, the familiar thrum of the observatory seemed to pulse with an unnatural resonance. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and the illusion vanished, leaving behind only the dull sheen of steel. A trick of the light, I told myself, a symptom of too many hours staring at screens. My mind was playing tricks, surely. Later, needing air that didn't taste of recycled oxygen and ozone, I ventured out, down the winding, gravel path that led from my isolated station. The air was thick with mist, a permanent fixture in this coastal region. As I descended, the mist grew denser, swirling around me like a living thing. The houses of the foggy village emerged slowly from the vapor, their muted colors softened by the haze. I saw the fisherman, old and stooped, mending his nets by the harbor wall. His movements were slow, methodical, a familiar tableau. But as I watched, a subtle shift occurred. The threads of his net seemed to elongate, to stretch beyond their natural limits, weaving themselves into a pattern that mimicked the impossible geometry I'd seen on my screens. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled, my boots scuffing against loose gravel. The vision snapped back, the foggy village settling into its usual, mundane reality. The fisherman continued his work, oblivious, his net a simple mesh of twine. Had I truly seen it? Or was my mind, frayed by sleep deprivation and cosmic revelation, finally breaking? My determination, once a sturdy shield, now felt fragile, pitted by an insidious doubt. It was bleeding into the world, painting reality with its impossible brush, and I, Grant Chen, was its unwilling canvas. The question was no longer what it was, but what it was doing to me, and how much of myself remained untouched by its silent, pervasive touch. It spoke to something primal, an echo deep within the hollows of my own skull. It bypassed my ears, my eyes, sinking directly into the soft clay of my being. Abstract concepts bloomed in my mind, unbidden and grotesque. I saw, without seeing, the unraveling of threads, the slow, inevitable collapse of forms I couldn't name. It was a language of pure existence and non-existence, a dialect of the void itself. It was the fear of being unmade, of having the very architecture of myself dissolved into the cosmic dust from which it had sprung. I stumbled back from the console, my hands pressed to my temples as if to hold my thoughts in place. Then came the images. Not flashes, but slow, deliberate constructions within my inner eye. They were fragments of my past, yet subtly wrong. I remembered my mother's face, her smile, but in this new iteration, her eyes were vacant, obsidian pools reflecting nothing but an infinite, silent scream. A particular memory, one I hadn't consciously thought of in decades, surged forward. A small, forgotten incident from childhood, a trip to a peculiar, isolated place my family had visited only once. A foggy village. The memory had always been benign, a hazy recollection of damp air and quiet streets. But now, it was overlaid with an unbearable sense of foreboding. The fog wasn't just atmospheric, it was a living, breathing entity, coiling around skeletal trees, obscuring grotesque shapes I couldn't quite discern. This wasn't just recall, it was an imposition, a revision. The signal wasn't merely showing me fears, it was manufacturing them, grafting them onto the very roots of my personal history. It was rewriting me, atom by atom, memory by memory. A desperate, primal urge seized me, I had to see it. The drive was a blur, a journey dictated by an instinct that felt both my own and utterly alien. The landscape outside the window seemed to shift, the familiar highway signs blurring into indecipherable glyphs, the trees along the roadside twisting into gaunt, accusing figures. The world was beginning to conform to the signal's internal logic, mirroring the chaos it had sown within me. Hours later, the light of dawn was a sickly gray smear against a sky heavy with moisture. Then, through the thinning mist, I saw it, the sign, weathered and almost illegible, marking the entrance to the foggy village. It was exactly as the revised memory had shown me. The fog, a tangible presence, swallowed the village whole, muffling sound, blurring edges. The silence was profound, but beneath it, I could feel the signal vibrating, resonating with the very air. This wasn't just a place, it was a canvas for the horrors blooming within me. I walked down a narrow, cobblestone lane, the stones slick with moisture. I remembered laughter. A small figure, impossibly frail, stood at the alley's mouth, its back to me. The figure turned, slowly, and I saw my own child's face, but the eyes were not my own. They were the vacant, obsidian pools I had seen on my mother's face in the signal's manufactured vision. And in its small, trembling hand, it clutched not a red ball, but a shard of polished black stone, reflecting the fog-shrouded street like a fragment of captured night. This was not a memory. I could no longer trust what I remembered, what I knew. The ground beneath my feet was not solid earth, but shifting sand, and the fog around me was not just weather, but the creeping tendrils of a reality that was no longer my own. The signal, a silent, immense pressure, had taken root. It had bypassed the usual gates of perception, burrowing instead into the very bedrock of my consciousness. Sleep offered no reprieve, the patterns, intricate and alien, danced behind my eyelids, weaving themselves into nightmares of impossible geometries and abyssal depths. A gnawing, inexplicable urge began to stir within me, a compass needle spun wild, yet pointing with unsettling certainty. It wasn't logic, nor was it intuition, it was a pure, unadulterated necessity. The coordinates whispered not from the signal, but from an emergent, unfamiliar part of myself, guiding me away from the familiar hum of my equipment, towards a place I'd never consciously considered. The world outside my window seemed to flatten, its colors leaching away, replaced by a monotonous gray. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, a desperate anchor against the current dragging me forward. I wasn't driving, I was being drawn. Then, through the thinning mist of a forgotten highway, it appeared, the foggy village. It wasn't on any main thoroughfare, tucked away like a secret only the lost could find. A pall of dense, swirling mist clung to the cobblestone lanes, obscuring the rooftops and softening the edges of the ancient stone buildings. The few figures I glimpsed moving through the shroud of white were hunched, indistinct shapes, their movements slow and deliberate, as if burdened by the very air they breathed. I parked my vehicle near a skeletal oak, its branches reaching like gnarled fingers into the milky sky. The compulsion tightened, a cord drawing me deeper into the labyrinthine alleys. My steps finally faltered before a squat, unassuming building, its wooden sign, weathered and almost illegible, creaking faintly in the non-existent breeze. It was a small shop, crammed with dusty relics and forgotten histories. A single, weak lantern cast an anemic glow from within, illuminating shelves heavy with bound volumes, ancient maps, and arcane trinkets. The air inside was thick with the smell of aging paper and something else, something like dried herbs and forgotten incense. Behind a counter, a figure emerged from the gloom, a woman with eyes like polished stones and hair the color of ash. She wore a heavy, homespun shawl, and her face, etched with countless lines, seemed to hold the weight of all the village's unspoken stories. She didn't speak, merely watched me with an unnerving stillness. I didn't know what I was looking for, but my hand, as if guided by an invisible thread, reached for a shelf stacked with oversized, leather-bound tomes. My fingers brushed across rough spines, feeling the brittle parchment beneath. And then, there it was. It had no title, no author. The woman behind the counter remained silent, her gaze unwavering, almost accusatory. Outside, beneath the swirling mantle of fog, I found a low stone bench near a gnarled yew tree and opened the book. The pages were thick, almost like bark, filled not with script, but with symbols. They were stark, angular, yet possessed a fluid, unsettling grace. And then I saw it. A pattern, repeated across several pages, a sequence of interlocking lines and impossible angles that mirrored, with terrifying precision, the fundamental structure of the signal that had invaded my mind. It wasn't a mere resemblance, it was an exact replication. The same intricate lattice, the same resonant nodes, the same sense of infinite depth contained within finite form. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a blueprint. These symbols, etched into this ancient, nameless tome, were the visual manifestation of the signal's core identity. A wave of vertigo washed over me, the foggy village spinning for a moment before righting itself. The cold air seemed to press in, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible drone. The text wasn't merely old, it was pre-human. The signal was not a novel discovery, it was a rediscovery. And these symbols, these forbidden glyphs, were not meant to be read, but understood. The world, the solid, predictable world I thought I knew, began to shimmer at the edges. It was a veil, and I had just torn a corner away. Sleep offered no solace, only a deeper immersion into the signal's silent, immense pressure. It had bypassed the usual gates of perception, burrowing instead into the very bedrock of my consciousness, and now, even in the supposed sanctuary of slumber, it had begun its work. I woke to a world subtly, terrifyingly, askew. In its place, a low, guttural thrum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound both alien and intimately known, as if it resonated from within my own skull. I pushed myself from the tangled sheets, the room's air thick and cold. My hand reached for the ceramic mug I always left on the bedside table, but my fingers closed on thin air. The mug, a chipped blue relic from a forgotten trip, now sat on the far side of the room, perched precariously on a stack of books that hadn't been there the night before. My breath hitched. I knew the layout of this cottage better than my own reflection, every creak, every shadow. This was wrong. I dressed quickly, my movements stiff, as if my limbs were unfamiliar instruments. The mirror in the bathroom showed me a face that was mine, yet not entirely. The lines around my eyes seemed deeper, etched with a fatigue that felt primordial. My reflection blinked a fraction of a second after I did, a lag that stretched into an eternity, then snapped back into sync with a jolt that sent a tremor through my chest. I splashed cold water on my face, the chill doing little to dispel the creeping unease. The fog outside the cottage was a living thing, a shroud that had swallowed the entire foggy village. It clung to the ancient stone walls, seeped into the narrow lanes, and muffled every sound until the world felt like a forgotten dream. I needed supplies, a desperate attempt at normalcy. I wrestled with the ignition, the seconds stretching into a painful eternity, then collapsing into an instant of sudden roar. I was out, weaving through the spectral streets. The village market, typically a hub of quiet activity, was a blur of shifting forms. The stall of the baker, usually overflowing with golden loaves, now held an impossible array of polished stones, each one humming with that same internal vibration I felt. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and the stones were gone, replaced by the familiar crusty bread, but the baker's face. The baker, a stout man with kind eyes, looked at me with an expression that was both welcoming and utterly vacant. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't quite grasp, the sounds echoing strangely in the fog. Was he speaking backward? Or was I hearing it that way? I tried to focus, to ground myself. He handed me the bread, his fingers brushing mine. For a moment, his hand seemed to have too many joints, too many knuckles, then it solidified into the familiar, calloused hand I knew. I snatched the bread, paid. With trembling fingers, and hurried away, the baker's unblinking gaze a tangible weight on my back. Back in my truck, the engine started instantly, without protest, as if the previous struggle had been a fabrication. I stared at it, then at my hands, then at the road ahead, which seemed to stretch infinitely, the fog swallowing the familiar bends. I drove, or thought I drove, for what felt like hours, yet the odometer had barely ticked over a mile. The village, which should have been behind me, still loomed in my rearview mirror, its spectral outlines unwavering. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the damp cobblestones. It was a local, a quiet man who kept to himself, often seen walking the paths. He stood there, unmoving, his face obscured by the swirling mist. He didn't answer. Slowly, deliberately, he raised a hand. His fingers, long and slender, curled into an impossible shape, a gesture that defied anatomy. Then, his head tilted, his features becoming clear through the fog, but they weren't his features. They were a mosaic, a shifting collage of unfamiliar eyes, a stranger's nose, a mouth that stretched too wide, too thin, then reformed into something else entirely. It was a face constructed from raw, dislocated parts, a fleeting glimpse of something that shouldn't be. This wasn't just a signal I had detected. It was an intrusion, a fundamental rewriting. It wasn't merely distorting my perception, it was actively resculpting the world around me, bending reality to its own incomprehensible will. The boundaries of what was real and what was born of the signal's influence had not merely blurred, they had dissolved. I was trapped within its unfolding, a prisoner in a reality that was no longer mine, but a canvas for something ancient and vast to paint its horrors upon. The man in the road, no longer a man but a manifestation, began to ripple, his form elongating, stretching into the mist, becoming one with the swirling vapor until only the sound of that deep, internal thrumming remained. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as the foggy village, a place I had once called home, dissolved into a nightmare of shifting perceptions. Was he speaking? The air around me felt thick, not just with mist, but with a palpable pressure, a silent hum that vibrated behind my eyes. I leaned closer, trying to discern the meaning in his shifting face, in the sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He gestured vaguely, his hand a blur in the opalescent air, towards something beyond the bakery's open door, deeper into the foggy village. It wasn't the chill of the mist, but something far more intimate, a subtle loosening of the threads that held my thoughts together. A sudden, inexplicable confusion bloomed in my chest. Why was I here? What errand had brought me to this spectral place, standing before a man whose face refused to settle? But the word caught a stone in my throat. My name. The simple sequence of sounds, the identity I had worn for decades, felt suddenly alien, a borrowed garment that no longer fit. I squeezed my eyes shut, a desperate attempt to reset the internal landscape, to banish the encroaching haze. When I opened them, the baker was gone, or perhaps he had never been there at all. I knew I was Grant. Or, I had been Grant. Grant Chen. The syllables felt like pebbles in my mouth, heavy and meaningless. What did it mean to be Grant? A radio astronomer, I thought, a man who sought patterns in the cosmic static, who had found. What had I found? The signal. Yes, the signal. That was it. But the memory was faint, like a photograph bleached by too much sun. The observatory, the hum of the dishes, the sterile scent of ozone and metal, these were ghosts now, impressions without substance. The foggy village pressed in, its indistinct shapes mirroring the erosion within my mind. Cobblestones beneath my boots seemed to shift, reconfigure. It was as if a vast, unseen hand was sifting through my memories, discarding them like dust. My childhood home, the faces of my colleagues, the specific curve of a favorite coffee mug, each detail shimmered, threatened to dissolve into the ubiquitous gray. It wasn't a thought, but a state, a complete dissolution of self into an indifferent, monumental awareness. No. I clenched my fists, the dull ache in my knuckles a welcome anchor. I was Grant. I was. I focused on the pain, on the tangible pressure of my boots on the shifting ground. I forced myself to recall my work. The late nights, the thrill of discovery, the specific coordinates I had punched into the console. The taste of stale coffee. These were mine. They had to be mine. Who is Grant? What is a Grant in the face of all that is? The questions were not spoken, but felt, a tendril of insidious thought that was not my own, worming its way into the deepest recesses of my mind. I stumbled forward, blindly, the need to move, to escape this internal siege, becoming paramount. I would not become a vessel for that monstrous, indifferent awareness. I would not. I was Grant, and I would fight for every atom of that fragile, precious truth. The foggy village stretched on, an endless, shifting maze, and I, a man on the precipice of oblivion, pushed through it, clawing at the tattered remnants of who I was. The baker's face rippled, a shimmering distortion across his kind features, like a reflection on agitated water. The fog, thick and cloying, seemed to absorb the very air, pressing in, making each breath a conscious effort. I stood rooted, my determination a fragile ember against the encroaching strangeness, trying to anchor myself to the solid ground I remembered. What? What are you saying? I managed, my voice thin, dissolving into the damp air. My hand, when I raised it, felt foreign, a marionette's limb. The baker's eyes, once warm, now held a deep, unsettling vacancy, like windows to an empty house. He simply gestured, a slow, fluid motion that lacked the crispness of human movement, towards the heart of the foggy village. The buildings, previously quaint and timbered, seemed to waver, their edges blurring, then sharpening into impossible angles. The silence, punctuated only by the drip of unseen moisture, felt stretched, taut, ready to snap. The village square was a vortex of shifting forms. A cart, laden with what appeared to be root vegetables, seemed to dissolve and reform, its wheels briefly becoming spokes of pure light before settling back into rusted iron. A child, no more than 6, chased a spectral dog, their laughter a brittle, crystalline sound that grated against my ears. As the child passed near me, their form briefly stretched, elongated, their head turning to reveal not a face, but a smooth, featureless oval, before snapping back into childish normalcy. My stomach churned, and I pressed a hand to my mouth, fighting back a wave of nausea. This was not a hallucination, it was too consistent, too deliberate in its inconsistency. I moved with a growing sense of urgency, my footsteps muffled by the pervasive mist. The smell of damp earth and something acrid, metallic, permeated the air. I saw a group of villagers gathered near a well, their forms intertwined, their limbs seeming to phase through each other as they spoke in a murmuring chorus. Their faces were a kaleidoscope of expressions, shifting from joy to sorrow to indifference in the blink of an eye, never quite settling. Their words were a jumble, a mosaic of sounds that held no meaning, yet conveyed a profound, unsettling resonance, like a choir of broken instruments. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the unraveling world. I remembered the signal, its impossible complexity, its ancient rhythm. A sudden, sharp clarity pierced through the fog, a moment of horrifying lucidity. It was not a signal that carried information about something. It was the thing itself. The signal was not a messenger, it was the mechanism of transformation, the very essence of an intelligence that did not communicate in data or images, but in the rewriting of reality. It was an entity that did not exist in a physical sense, but manifested through perception. Their shifting forms, their meaningless words, their vacant eyes, they were the raw material, the perception being digested. This foggy village, with its wavering structures and echoing sounds, was not a place, but a stage, a canvas upon which this ancient, indifferent intelligence painted its existence by erasing ours. The signal, the unraveling, the consumption of perception. It wasn't happening around me. It was happening to me, through me. The deep, resonant hum I'd felt in my bones, the subtle shifts in my own memories, the growing sense of detachment from my own identity, these were not side effects. They were the entity's tendrils, weaving themselves into the fabric of my consciousness, making me a part of its grand, horrifying meal. I looked at my hands, and for a terrifying instant, they were not my hands. My memories, once solid anchors, now felt like wisps of smoke, dissolving into the pervasive fog. The universe I knew, the scientific principles I had built my life upon, were not simply being challenged, they were being devoured. I was not an observer of this horror, I was its host, its conduit, its next course. The ancient intelligence was not speaking to me, it was speaking as me, experiencing existence through my dissolving perception, adding my unraveling self to its endless, indifferent tapestry. The village, the baker, the child, they were already gone, merely echoes. Soon, I would be too. The profound, terrifying truth settled over me like a shroud, I was already consumed. The baker's face, a moment before a canvas of kind lines, now rippled, a shimmering distortion across his features like a reflection on agitated water. The fog, thick and tasting of ancient salt and something else unnameable, coiled around us, not just obscuring the world but seeming to shape it. I stood there, my own breath a shallow intake of the damp, shifting air, and felt the last vestiges of the man I had been detached, like dry leaves from a branch in an unfelt wind. Chen, the radio astronomer, the seeker of distant signals, was a memory, a faint hum in the vast, silent chamber of my new being. This wasn't a loss, not truly. It was a shedding, a necessary divestment for the journey ahead, a journey already underway. The baker, or the semblance of one, receded. His form elongated, then compressed, a fleeting sculpture of mist and shadow. The wooden stall behind him, laden with impossible pastries that pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, became a fleeting sketch, then vanished, absorbed by the encroaching veil. I took a step, then another. Each stride was a deliberate act, not of navigation, but of communion. The village itself was a tapestry woven from memory and suggestion. A distant bell chimed, not with a clear metallic note, but with a lingering taste of rust and regret on my tongue. The cry of a gull was not heard, but felt as a sudden, sharp ache behind my eyes. I walked through the lanes, and the fog parted for me, not in a draft, but in a silent, respectful deference. It was as if the very air knew me, recognized the shift within, and rearranged itself to facilitate my passage. A small group of figures emerged from the swirling gray, a child, no older than 7, holding the hand of an elderly woman. Their faces were fluid, like the baker's, their features perpetually rearranging themselves, hinting at countless expressions, none fully formed. Yet, I understood them. Not their words, for they spoke none, but their essence. The child's presence was a question, an unformed query about the nature of existence. The old woman's was an answer, a quiet resignation, an understanding of the perpetual flux. It had not merely sent a message, it had become the messenger, and in doing so, had reshaped the vessel. I was no longer Chen receiving a transmission, I was the transmission, made manifest in this shifting, dreamlike reality. This was the new horizon, not a distant discovery, but an internal landscape, boundless and terrifying in its implications. My hands, I noticed, seemed to glow faintly at the edges, a subtle phosphorescence that pulsed with my heartbeat. When I reached out to touch a weathered wooden fence post, it yielded like clay, reforming into a swirling pattern of intricate, meaningless symbols beneath my fingertips. The world was malleable, responsive to my presence, or rather, to the presence within me. I was not merely observing this altered reality, I was, in some fundamental way, its anchor, its interpreter, perhaps even its silent, unwitting architect. I was a conduit, a living monument to the signal's power, a focal point where its impossible geometries and perceptions converged and were given form. The entity had not just invaded my mind, it had expanded it, remade it into a prism through which its own reality could bleed into this one. My consciousness was the canvas, and the foggy village, with its shifting forms and silent inhabitants, was the initial masterpiece. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the very air, not a sound I heard, but a sensation that vibrated through my bones, through the spongy ground, through the malleable architecture. It was the entity's song, its endless, complex harmony. And I, Grant, no longer simply Grant, felt an undeniable urge to move, to explore this new horizon, to walk deeper into the fog, knowing that with every step, I was not merely witnessing creation, but participating in it. The tension was not of fear, but of profound, unsettling purpose. My new existence was not a choice, but a destiny, and I was determined to see its full, terrifying unfolding. I saw the movement of his lips, the slight furrow of his brow, but the connection between these physical gestures and any comprehensible meaning had frayed, snapped. A cold, damp air, thick with the scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke, pressed against me. I stood on the cobbled path of the foggy village, the swirling mist an ever-present veil that now seemed to hum with an unheard frequency, a faint vibration that resonated deep within my bones. The baker, a man I had known. Thought I had known, for weeks in this strange, quiet place, receded into the distortion, his form elongating, then compressing, like an image caught in a funhouse mirror that was slowly melting. "What is happening?" The words were a brittle whisper, tasting of ash in my mouth. I didn't speak them aloud. I couldn't be sure if I even formed them with my tongue. They were another impression, a thought shiver. My own hands, when I raised them, appeared to be composed of shifting light, the individual fingers blurring at the edges, their substance less solid, more suggestion. This was my reality now, a fractured, iridescent tapestry. I turned from the baker's shop, its familiar sign now a series of overlapping, glowing glyphs, and stepped further into the heart of the foggy village. The mist was no longer merely atmospheric, it was a living membrane, pulsing with faint, internal light. The houses, half hidden by the drifting vapor, seemed to breathe, their windows like eyes that watched with an unnerving, knowing stillness. The sound that escaped my lips was not my own voice, but a jumble of discordant tones, a fragmented chord, like a broken music box attempting to play. The woman paused, her head tilting. Her face, too, began to ripple, but not as violently as the baker's. It was a subtler shift, a momentary blurring of her eyes, a slight elongation of her jaw before it snapped back into place. She regarded me with an expression of mild confusion, her gaze seeming to pass through me, as if I were a ghost. "Are you quite well, sir?" Her voice reached me, clear and resonant, a sharp contrast to the internal cacophony. It was a true sound, a solid thing, and for a fleeting moment, a sliver of the old world pierced through the new. "The fog," I began, my voice attempting to coalesce, "it's different. Can you see it? The way it moves, the patterns within it?" I gestured wildly, my hand leaving trails of shimmering afterimages in the air. The houses, there. Alive. And the faces, they shimmer, they shift. The woman's expression hardened, a flicker of something akin to fear crossing her features. She clutched her basket tighter. "The fog is as it always is in the foggy village," she said, her voice now edged with a dismissive coolness. "And the houses are old, yes, but they stand firm. Perhaps you should find shelter from the damp." She sidestepped me, her movements precise, her eyes refusing to meet mine. I watched her walk away, her form solid, unyielding, a stark, painful contrast to my own disintegrating perceptions. It wasn't just that my reality was changing, it was that theirs remained stubbornly, terrifyingly constant. I was seeing the world through a lens no one else possessed, a lens that revealed a deeper, more fluid truth, but at the cost of any shared understanding. The chasm between my experience and theirs was absolute, unbridgeable. I was utterly alone in this revelation. The determination that had flickered earlier now solidified into a grim resolve. If I was to be the sole witness to this unraveling, then I would witness it fully. If this was the truth the signal offered, then I would walk its labyrinthine paths, alone. I saw the shimmering patterns in the fog, the breathing walls of the houses, the fractured faces of the villagers, and understood that this was not madness, but a new, terrifying clarity. I was no longer Grant Chen, the radio astronomer. I was the conduit, the lens, the sole recipient of a reality that defied all previous definitions. And the descent into its depths had only just begun. The woman's words, dismissive as they were, still clung to the damp air like the fog itself. "The fog is as it always is in the foggy village," she'd said, her eyes opaque, unseeing. "And the houses are old, yes. They stand firm. But I knew, with a terrible certainty that clawed at my insides, that she lied. Or perhaps, her perception had simply been rewritten, woven into the seamless fabric of this place, just as mine was threatening to be. I watched her vanish into the swirling gray, her basket a phantom against the muted light, and a shiver, not of cold, but of profound dread, traced its way down my spine. The houses were old, yes, their timber groaning under centuries of moisture, but they no longer stood firm. They breathed. I had seen it, felt it. The timber beams pulsed with a slow, organic rhythm, and the windows, dark and vacant, seemed to gaze back with an ancient, knowing patience. The very cobblestones beneath my worn boots felt less like stone and more like hardened flesh, each step a dull thud against something vast and dormant. It wasn't sound, not truly, but a resonance that vibrated through bone and nerve, a silent language unspooling within the deepest chambers of my mind. It spoke not in words, but in patterns, in shifting geometries that rearranged the very notion of space. I saw the foggy village not as a collection of structures, but as a single, sprawling organism, its arteries the narrow lanes, its breath the perpetual mist. My determination, a fragile ember in this encroaching tide, urged me forward. I had to understand what the woman could not. I walked past the cottage where I first encountered the silent children, their faces pale as porcelain. It was the signal, bleeding into the physical world, twisting light, bending perception. I pressed my palm against the cool, rough wood of a nearby wall. The vibration was undeniable now, a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth, yet felt intensely personal, as if it originated from within me. It was a language of sensation, a truth beyond sound. The timber was not merely old, it was ancient in a way that defied geological time, imbued with a memory older than stars. I stumbled upon the square, a space I remembered as being open, but now it felt constricted, the buildings leaning inward, their roofs almost touching, forming a gnarled canopy of slate and moss. The air grew heavy, cloying, as if I were breathing water. And then I saw it. In the very center of what should have been an empty square, a structure had risen. It was not built of wood or stone, but of the fog itself, coalesced into impossible angles and shifting planes, a phantom edifice that seemed to exist and not exist simultaneously. It pulsed, a silent beacon, drawing the mist inward, exhaling it in slow, deliberate plumes. This was the heart of the village, the truth of its transformation. A figure emerged from the shifting walls of the fog structure. It was a man, his features indistinct, shrouded by the pervasive mist, yet I felt his gaze upon me, a weight that pressed down on my very soul. The man raised a hand, slowly, deliberately. It was not a gesture of greeting or warning, but of invitation. An invitation to cease resisting, to surrender to the unfolding reality. The air around him shimmered, and I saw, not with my eyes, but with an inner knowing, that the fog itself was composed of infinitely complex patterns, the very architecture of the signal made manifest. It was not a natural phenomenon, it was a living, breathing component of the entity. As I stared, the edges of my vision blurred. The lines between myself and the foggy village began to dissolve. The resonant hum intensified, vibrating not just in my bones, but in the very fibers of my being. It was a symphony of understanding, a terrible, beautiful unraveling. My identity, once a solid construct, became fluid, permeable. I felt the pulse of the timber houses, the ancient memory of the cobblestones, the cool, consuming breath of the fog structure. The man in the fog structure extended his hand further, and I found myself taking an involuntary step forward. My mind, once a fortress, was now a gateway, and the signal poured in, not as information, but as existence. It was not rewriting my reality, it was revealing its true, ancient form, and I was a part of it. My name, Grant, felt foreign, a forgotten echo from a distant shore. I was no longer an observer, an isolated astronomer. I was a conduit, a vessel. The foggy village was not just a place, it was a node, and I, its newest receptor. The transformation was complete, not with a bang, but with a silent, all-encompassing sigh. The man lowered his hand. He did not need to speak. I understood. The signal had found its way. It had burrowed into the soft, yielding clay of human perception, and now, through me, it would spread. The fog, I realized, stretched far beyond the confines of this village, a silent, creeping tide that would eventually touch every corner of the world, revealing the truth of its impossible age, its unending resonance. The endless echo had just begun.